Today's story really has just a wild plot twist. And that's kind of what we do on this channel. We look for stories with crazy plot twists. This is a big one. So the story opens with these police officers in Lebanon that have been sent to this beach to go investigate this strange object on the sand. And they go to this object and they're sort of bewildered by it. And as the story progresses, you have a pretty good idea of what this is, why it happened, and likely what's going to be the outcome. But then at the very end of the story, when you're like, yeah, this is pretty predictable, it just goes completely into left field. And you're going to be left being like, I've never heard a story like that. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and take all their ball caps and fold the bill into Mickey Mouse ears. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One night in late January of 1965, a police officer named Fareed Jaber, along with another officer, his partner, were walking along a beach in Antilias, Lebanon, which is a tiny village just north of Beirut. The weather was absolutely terrible. It was freezing out, it was pouring rain, and it's nighttime, so it's dark out. I mean, this is a pretty nasty time to be out, walking around. As much as Fareed and very likely his partner would have desperately liked to have been home in bed right now, they knew that, they both needed this job, especially Fareed. It paid well and he couldn't afford to lose it. And so sometimes doing this job, being a cop, was pretty uncomfortable. And he'd sort of just accepted that. Now, the reason that Fareed and his partner were out here right now patrolling this beach in this terrible weather was because somebody had called in and said that they saw something odd on the beach. And they thought maybe it could be a dead body, or it could just be a body, period. They didn't know, but there was something odd on the beach. And so the police were called to go have a look. Now, this part of Lebanon was considered pretty safe. So, the idea of bodies turning up sort of out on the beach or out, in public anywhere was just sort of unheard of. And so Fareed and his partner really didn't expect to walk up on a dead body or something. In fact, Fareed really just expected to find some dead sea creature or something, or maybe some trash, he didn't know what. But, as he's walking along with his jacket pulled around tight and he's scanning the beach with his flashlight, battling the weather, he just felt kind of annoyed that they were out here. Like, this is going to be nothing. Like, why are we even being called out here? There's no way there's literally a body on the beach right now. But sure enough, as Fareed and his partner continued walking along the beach, looking around with their flashlights, far down the beach, right in the middle of the sand, they did see this odd object just laying out on the sand. And even at first glance, from a distance, it did look human-like. It definitely had the form where it could be a person. And so right away, Fareed and his partner are like, clearly that's what was called in. This is what we're here to investigate. Now, the two of them didn't run over to whatever this was. They have no idea what's going on here. I mean, if this really is a person, they don't know why they're here, if there's somebody that hurt them that's in the vicinity. So they're playing it safe. They're walking up slowly, scanning the whole beach, looking for any other indication of, whatever this is. Maybe there's other things that are odd on the beach, but there was nothing. It was just this odd body-like thing on the sand. But as they got closer, Fareed in particular, he's looking at this object and he's like, that is definitely a person. I can tell that's a body on the ground. But there was just something odd about the body. It just looked off. There was just something unnatural about it. There's something that he couldn't put his finger on, but he's gonna find out when he gets close. And so Fareed and his partner, they get closer and closer, and both their flashlights are trained on this human-like thing. And then finally they're standing right over it and they look down and for sure, this is a person. But they could now see, now that they're right up close, why this person seemed off. And it was because this body was missing its head. Now, right away, it seemed fairly apparent to Fareed and his partner that this body, one, belonged to a man, and two, very likely they did not die of like an accidental drowning and get washed up on shore or something. Very likely, especially because of the decapitation, this man was murdered. Somebody killed him and likely dumped him here, or maybe dumped him in the water and then he washed up here. But this is This is foul play. And so Fareed and the partner, they're like, okay, we got to search the area, do a cursory search, and just make sure, whoever did this isn't just nearby. We need to secure the scene. And so they drew their guns and they walked the area, but there was nobody else there. The beach is totally, desolate, minus this body and the police officers. And so after doing that cursory search and coming back to the body, Fareed and his partner began talking about what they were going to do. Now remember, this is the mid-1960s in a small rural village in Lebanon. So this is not like a robust police department that Fareed and his partner were a part of. They did not have, huge resources to process this, vicious homicide, or at least what it looked to be a vicious homicide. They didn't even have radios to call in backup. I mean, they knew at best what they'd be able to do here is maybe by tomorrow, they could have a couple more officers come out and begin to investigate and see what happened here. But just to do that, it would require literally going back to the station and rallying support and explaining what's going on and coming up with a plan and going out and doing that. And so as they're sort of talking through what they should do, because again, also remember, this is not an area where homicides take place either. I mean, this is pretty anomalous. So they don't even necessarily know how to process a homicide, but they say, okay, our best bet is one of us just needs to stay here with the body, basically guard the crime scene. And the other will go back to the station and file the paperwork and get this machine in motion so that tomorrow we can actually begin investigating. So basically one of them would have to stay the night literally on the beach in the freezing cold and the rain next to this dead body to make sure nobody came back to claim it or desecrate it in some way. And as they're talking about who was going to do that, Fareed was the more junior officer, and so pretty quickly it became clear that he was going to have to do it. And again, going back to the earlier part in the story where Fareed, he knew this job could be very uncomfortable sometimes, but he needed this job. He needed the income. He couldn't afford to lose this job. And so when it was sort of clear this was going to be his doing, he said, fine, I'll stay here. I'll stay with the body. You go, get the investigation started, and I'll see you tomorrow. Now, after Fareed's partner had left and had walked down the beach and disappeared, Fareed sort of realized just how bad this night was going to be. I mean, think about it. Not only is the weather awful, but he's literally, sitting next to a decapitated body. He's going to be just, in the company of this dead body all night. And on top of that, he suspects that somebody has killed this guy. This guy's been murdered. And maybe this body has been dumped here by the murderer. And even though they did a cursory search, it wasn't 100% certain that the killer or killers were not somewhere in the area. And so Fareed's thinking okay, I have to guard the body and be careful not to get attacked by the killer who could be, nearby. I mean, this is straight out of a nightmare. But, at the same time, Fareed's thinking to himself, I'm a trained police officer. I have my issued gun and my issued knife. I'm not completely defenseless here. If somebody were to come out here and attack me, I could hold my own. I could defend myself. And so he's at least telling himself that. And so as the rain continues to just pound down on Fareed, he's shivering, he's miserable. He knows he's supposed to be alert and, watching this crime scene. He's not supposed to sleep. But he's so uncomfortable that he finds himself getting down on the sand and kind of, getting into the fetal position, trying to find a little bit of comfort. And at some point he does get a little comfortable, in fact, so comfortable that despite how awful it was outside, he did fall asleep at about maybe 2, 3 in the morning. And so Fareed falls asleep, and then a few hours later, he wakes up and he's in a panic because he knows he wasn't supposed to fall asleep. He's supposed to be guarding this crime scene to make sure nobody touches this body. And also remember, he thinks the killer could be out here, it's an actual real possibility. They might come back and do something to the body, and he's just fallen asleep. And so he kind of scrambles to his feet. He's taking stock of the scene. It's still raining. It's still cold and dark out. And he turns and he looks where the body was supposed to be, and it's gone. The body is gone. And so instinctively, he's thinking, oh, the killer's nearby. They must have grabbed the body. He reaches for his gun, and his holster's empty. And so now it's truly a nightmare scenario for Fareed. He was supposed to be here to watch the crime scene, and he allowed the body to be taken, and he's been disarmed. Now, fortunately, he had his, service knife, and he pulled that out. That's all he's got at this point. But he's thinking, I'm screwed. What happened? Where did it go? Where'd the body go? Where'd my gun go? What do I do? And so he starts thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe an animal came by and grabbed the body and dragged the body, and it's nearby. And he's sort of looking up and down the beach, and he's thinking, it could be pretty far away. but he sees there's no drag marks. There's no way the body could have been dragged by an animal. And then also, what, an animal came back and unclipped his holster and took his gun out and took that away? That doesn't make any sense. He would have at least woken up if that was happening. But then he's like, well, wait a minute, maybe a wave came up and grabbed the body and dragged it into the ocean. That's why it's not here. That's why there's no drag marks. But he looked at where he was sleeping, and almost certainly, if the body had been struck with a big wave that dragged it into the ocean, Fareed would have been hit by that same wave, and he would have woken up. And then also, again, who took his gun? And so the realization hit Fareed that the only explanation here is a person came over here while I was asleep, took the body, took my gun, and now they're gone. So the night before, Fareed, the officer who was, left on the beach to guard the scene, the one who fell asleep, Fareed, his cousin, a man named Habib Jaber, had been walking along the beach alone when he had been attacked. This man had robbed him and then killed him and decapitated him. And he had left Habib's body on the shore. But he had taken his head and the money he had stolen from him back to his home. But several hours later, the killer realized maybe it had been a mistake to leave so much evidence behind, namely leaving behind the headless body. Maybe that could get them in trouble. So they decide, okay, I'm going to go back and get the body and bring it here as well to get rid of the evidence. But when the killer got back to the beach, back to the crime scene, he saw the body was now being guarded by a police officer. And that police officer was Fareed. Now, it's very important that you understand that Fareed, the officer, had no idea that the body he was guarding belonged to his cousin. All he knew was that this was a man who was killed. But because he was missing his head, he had not been able to identify him as his cousin. He just thought it was some stranger, some man had been killed, not his cousin. Now, when the killer got to the beach, he was about to turn around because he sees I can't do anything because, this officer is guarding the body. What can I do? But he snuck up a little bit closer and he realized the police officer, Fareed, he had fallen asleep on the job. And so while Fareed was sleeping, the killer did walk up, pick up the body, carry it off to his house, which was not far away. And he also went back and he took Fareed's gun out of his holster, all while Fareed was asleep. So literally the worst thing that Fareed thought could have happened, that he was basically duped by the killer while he slept, did happen. So after the killer has taken the body and the gun away from Fareed and he's back at his home down the beach, he decided what he would do is he would start a big fire and he would dispose of the body that way. He would burn it in the fire and that would get rid of all the evidence and he'd be just fine. And so as the killer is chopping up firewood, basically at the end of the beach, not far from Fareed, believe it or not, he's chopping up all this firewood, Fareed wakes up in a panic, realizing, oh my gosh, the body's gone, my gun's gone, what do I do? And Fareed turns and he sees there's this man at the end of the beach who's chopping wood. Now, Fareed has no idea that man is actually literally the killer of his cousin. He has no idea. He just thinks it's some random dude who lives at the end of this beach who's chopping wood. But Fareed, he's so desperate to salvage his job, he's got to find this body, he's got to find his gun. He's thinking, man, this guy, he lives so close to the crime scene, maybe he saw something strange. Maybe he can help me find the body and my gun. And so Fareed walks on down the beach, not realizing he's about to come face to face with his cousin's killer. Fast forward several hours, and Fareed's partner finally returns to the beach, now with a team of detectives, and they're ready to investigate. And Fareed's partner, at first glance, looks down to the sand and he sees, one person standing there next to what appears to be a headless body on the ground, and he thinks, okay, there's Fareed and there's the body. The scene is the same as it was when I left it. But when they got a little bit closer, Fareed's partner started to notice something. The body on the ground, it had the wrong clothes on. They're different than what the body had on last night. What's going on here? This discrepancy would be made clear once Fareed's partner got down right next to the body and really got a look at it. He saw clearly the body is not the same as the night before. It's not just the clothes. Fareed's partner didn't know this, but it's not Fareed's cousin. That's not who this is. But the body also did not belong to Fareed either. Fareed was standing right next to the body. In fact, it would turn out really nothing about the scene that Fareed's partner found on the beach that morning was what it appeared to be at first glance. He and the rest of the team had to spend the rest of the morning searching the beach and the entire neighboring village and conducting countless interviews with potential witnesses to finally put it all together and make sense of it. And by the end of that day, the story that they managed to put together was so totally bizarre that it made headlines all over the world. Because Fareed was so desperate to keep his job, when he walked down the beach to go talk to that man chopping wood to see if he knew anything about what happened to the body, where did it go, did you see anything strange? As he was talking to this guy, again, not knowing it is literally the killer of your cousin. Fareed doesn't know this. He thinks it's a complete stranger. Fareed starts having this idea. He's like, well, wait a minute. I have my knife. What if I kill this man? No one's here. Cut his head off and put his body over there. No one will know. I'll replace the body. And so that's what Fareed did. He murdered this man, believing it was just some random guy to save his job. He's standing there when the partner comes down and he's like, look, I guarded the body. But it wasn't the body. It was a guy he murdered to save himself. But it just so happened to be that the guy he murdered was literally the killer of his cousin. Had no idea. And so even though in sort of a roundabout, backwards, vigilante way, justice was done here, Fareed took out the killer of his own cousin, even though that did technically happen, Fareed was still arrested for murder. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On December 30th, 2016, a woman sat down at her computer in her New Mexico home and pulled up the video feed from her surveillance system. Everybody in her neighborhood was terrified. There was a killer on the loose, and the police did not seem to have any idea who it could be or what their motivation was. So, on her computer, she scrolled back 2 days and began going through the footage frame by frame, looking for anything suspicious. And for a while, really nothing stood out on this recording. The only thing that really happened was her neighbor came home from a trip at some point, and then some time passed, and then the neighbor left again. That was basically it. And so the woman was starting to think that what she was doing was kind of pointless. Until, all of a sudden, in the corner of the screen, a dark figure appeared. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's bedroom and secretly hide alarm clocks all over the room that are all set to go off at various different points throughout the night. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of December 28, 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt drove down the highway into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Beside him was his 11-year-old daughter, Sienna, who had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. They'd been driving for nearly 12 hours, all the way from Don's mother's home in California, where they'd just spent Christmas. But the holiday had not really been a happy one, because a few weeks earlier, Don's sister, Janice, had died of breast cancer. And Janice was really one of the only true close family members Don had left. His dad and his other sister were both already dead, and his younger brother Dennis wasn't talking to him after a big argument the year before. So, as soon as Don had gotten the news that Janice had unfortunately passed away, he'd immediately negotiated with his ex-wife to take their daughter, Sienna, and go see his mom. He wished they could have stayed longer, but he had to get back to work. Don had a job at an agency that served the developmentally disabled, and there was a big meeting coming up that he just couldn't miss. Just then, Don slammed on his brakes. Traffic ahead was piling up, and the car in front of him had slowed down to an abrupt stop. Don felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, and he laid on his horn. He was about to roll down the window so he could scream at the driver in front of him, but then he saw Sienna open her eyes in alarm in the seat next to him, and he stopped himself. Don took a deep breath and reminded himself that it was just traffic and it wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have kind of a temper when it came to driving, But in recent years, he'd been working hard to control it so he could set a good example for his daughter. So after the traffic finally let up, and as he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through downtown Albuquerque toward his house, Don deliberately tried to shift his focus to something positive. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And that always made Don smile. Spaghetti Sunday was a tradition that he and Sienna had started together a few years ago by making big batches of food every Sunday after church and bringing the food downtown to feed the homeless. At first, it had just been the two of them, but over time, more people had joined in the effort, and pretty soon it had grown into a real event with whole groups of volunteers coming out to serve food and drop off clothes and canned goods. Don felt proud that he'd created something so meaningful for the community, and it was especially important to him that he had done it with Sienna. Finally, Don turned down a quiet residential street and parked in the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse decorated with Christmas lights. He got out of the car with Sienna, grabbed their suitcases, and walked to the front door and unlocked it. And when his daughter stepped inside, she shrieked with excitement, because waiting for her under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle wrapped in a shiny bow. She turned around and asked her dad if she could give the bike a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes, but it was already dark out, and this was supposed to be a quick stop at his house, and when he looked at the clock, he saw that it was almost 7. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday, and he had to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a pretty civil relationship, but he knew she would be annoyed if he asked for more time. So Don told Sienna the bike would have to wait, but for now, just go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would leave. As Sienna ran off, Don noticed something strange. He hadn't seen his golden retriever, Buddy, who usually rushed out to greet him whenever he came home. So Don walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name, and finally found the dog cowering in the bedroom. Don extended his hand, and Buddy skittishly came forward to sniff it. And Don was a little unnerved by this. Buddy usually did not act scared of him. But then again, Don didn't usually leave for weeks at a time either, so he just told himself that, maybe this was just separation anxiety. So he gave Buddy a pat on the head, filled his bowl with kibble, and then grabbed his keys for the short drive to his ex-wife Christine's house. Don drove to Christine's very slowly, trying to enjoy every last bit of his time with Sienna. Don treasured the time he had with his daughter, because the mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost gotten her taken away from him. These days, Don lived a squeaky clean life and went to church every Sunday, but it was not always that way. He had partied a lot when he was younger, and when Sienna was a toddler, he'd gotten fired from his dream job as a firefighter for failing a drug test. And then after he'd lost his job, his then wife, Christine, had to shoulder most of the family's bills, and after a few months, the strain on the marriage was just too much. Christine filed for divorce, which was crushing for Don, but even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Don actually already had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and after that divorce, his first wife had gotten sole custody of those kids and moved them all to Oklahoma, so Don had barely seen them for most of their childhoods. He was determined not to make that same mistake with Sienna. So he'd gone to court to fight Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten a little contentious, but it was worth it, and Don made the most of every moment he got to spend with Sienna. He'd braid her hair before school and make costumes for her school plays, and on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he always called her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Don pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway, and Christine came outside and stood by the front door with her arms crossed. She motioned to her watch, clearly annoyed that Don was late. Don got out of the car and sort of apologized and told her it had been a really long drive from California, and they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and they'd hit some traffic. That was why they were late. Christine sighed and said it was okay. She asked about the trip, and Don told her it went well. They had a great Christmas despite the, sadness over his sister's death, and it had been very meaningful just to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Don pulled her in for a big hug and kiss, and then he promised to call her before bed as usual. And when he saw her again that weekend, they'd have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Don pulled back into his garage 10 minutes later, he noticed that the trash can at the end of his driveway was lying overturned on its side. So he parked his truck, walked down to the curb, and flipped it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed a button to close the garage door, and unlocked the door to his townhouse. And while he was taking off his shoes and jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing and roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the sensor. He stopped to listen, and now what he heard was the sound of the door actually closing again and actually hitting the ground with a soft thud. He shook his head and decided he must be imagining things. Don dragged his suitcase into the bedroom and began to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and not really think about anything. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he saw a small hole in the ceiling and let out a frustrated sigh. Don had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months, and he'd been hoping it would have been done by the time he got home. So he made a mental note to give the landlord yet another call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Don put his jacket and his shoes back on and then headed out to the garage to smoke a cigarette. The following morning, December 29th, at the office where Don worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up and heard Don's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna told Valerie that her dad did not call her last night and asked if he was there now at the office. So Valerie stood up and peered over at Don's desk, but it was empty. This was a little unusual, since Don was a pretty punctual guy, but it was still early, so she told Sienna not to worry. She would give Don a call now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone, but he didn't answer. So she sent him a text message, and she waited. But after half an hour, Don still hadn't replied. And now Valerie was starting to feel concerned. It was not like Don to skip work without calling in, and then ignore calls and texts too. And so Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they decided to just go swing by Don's townhouse themselves and check on him. The sky over Don's townhouse was dark and cloudy when Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked on the door, but to her surprise, it actually just swung right open. She looked over at her coworker, then the two of them nervously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Don's name, but he didn't answer, so she wandered into the living room and peeked into the bedroom, but the house seemed empty. Valerie's coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Don on the second floor, and Valerie headed out to the garage to see if maybe Don's truck was there. And when Valerie opened the door to the two-car garage attached to the townhouse and flipped on the light, she saw Don's truck was in its usual spot. But something else caught her eye. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV, she noticed a streak of something dark red on the wall. At this point, Valerie started to feel pretty nervous. But nonetheless, she began walking towards that back wall to see what was going on over there. And as she got closer and closer, she was staring at the streak, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her, until finally she was close enough that she could actually look down at the space between the SUV and the red streaked wall. And when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, Albuquerque police detective Matthew Kaplan pulled up in front of a two-story stucco townhouse secured with yellow crime scene tape and swarming with police officers. Two women wearing business clothes were sitting on the curb, and both of their faces were stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew was that a man had been found dead in a garage attached to this townhouse, and now he, Detective Kaplan, was heading up the investigation. So he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door, and a policeman standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more details. The victim had been identified as Don Fluitt. The two women outside were his coworkers, who had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. There were no signs of forced entry, and the women said the front door was open when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse into the living room, and right away he saw a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. Then he did a slow loop through the first and second floors and noted there was a cell phone on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter. It didn't really look like anything had been rifled through. The drawers in the house were not hanging open, and the house generally was neat and orderly. And so on first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan like a robbery. Back on the first floor, Kaplan headed into the garage, where crime scene techs were busy photographing the scene and collecting forensic samples. Kaplan knelt down next to Don's body, which was laying face up between an SUV and the back wall. Don's throat was cut with a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other, and there were smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, his ear, and on his hand, as if he had tried to fight back. There were also signs of blunt force trauma, as if he had been hit by an object like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked closely, he saw burst capillaries on Don's eyes and eyelids, which he knew were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent and gruesome, which Kaplan knew meant this was likely personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the blood that was spattered on the walls and refrigerator above Don's body, and the bloody handprints on the side of Don's truck. There was no blood on the floor around Don. However, it sort of appeared like somebody had recently mopped and maybe tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty bottle of bleach on top of the washer nearby. So he walked over, he opened up the washer, and sure enough, he found piles of wet towels inside that actually still smelled like bleach. Just then, a crime scene tech came over carrying luminol spray, which is a chemical used by law enforcement to detect blood. And so Kaplan stepped back so he could spray the area, and then Kaplan followed him around as he made his way through the house. The luminol spray did pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and the sink too, and Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage and then wash their hands or the murder weapon in the kitchen before leaving. But it is much harder to scrub a murder scene than people realize, and so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually recover some of the killer's DNA. Kaplan stepped through the front door just as a car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car and pushed past the crime scene tape, and immediately Kaplan put his hands up to stop him. This man looked totally flustered, and he introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord, and asked what the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Don Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped, then started talking a mile a minute. He said Don was a devoted father and a religious man who would open up his home to anyone and that nobody would want to kill him. But then Benny paused and made a face like something was just occurring to him. And he said that actually, there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Don did charity work with the homeless, and he said it was possible that somebody from the street could have maybe broken into Don's house and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny, he sent him on his way, and then he just stood on Don's driveway, thinking about what Benny had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder, and the fact that nothing appeared to be stolen, he doubted very much that this had just been a break-in by a random homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Don's killer was someone Don knew, and maybe even someone who had a key, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Don was a big and muscular guy, and it was clear he had fought back with his attacker, Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially big male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Don Fluitt? From what the landlord and the two co-workers who had called 911 had said, Don seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan went to the house of Don's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had spoken to Christine the day before just to break the news about her ex-husband's death, and also to see what she might know about the murder. Christine hadn't had any ideas about who would have wanted to hurt Don, but she'd mentioned that he used to have a problem with road rage, and he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so, maybe he had gotten into it with another driver, and maybe they had followed him home. But she also said their daughter had been with him, and she didn't mention anything about that. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Don had actually told her that his dog was acting skittish when he had gotten back from that road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine as a suspect because she had an airtight alibi. Don had dropped Sienna off at Christine's around 7:45 the night he was killed, and then she and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together. Her road rage idea seemed as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but not particularly helpful in identifying a suspect. But now Kaplan was back at Christine's house because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry, who had been out of town last night for work since he was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Dawn's ex-wife, he was a natural suspect. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite smile. Kaplan entered the living room where Christine and Sienna were sitting and said hello, and then asked them to leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in an armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed calm and friendly as he told the detective that he and Dawn didn't have much contact with each other, but their relationship was not exactly bad. It was just awkward because of the custody battle Dawn had had with Christine. Ever since then, Terry said, he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Dawn. He knew Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked a conflict, Sienna would likely take Dawn's side. As for the night of Dawn's murder, Terry told Kaplan he was at his sister's house until about 9 p.m., and then he left and he stopped at Wendy's on the way to work, and then he took a nap in his truck in the parking lot before going in for his shift. After Kaplan left and went back to the station, he immediately called Terry's sister and also Terry's boss, and they both confirmed Terry's whereabouts, which meant that Terry's alibi was solid, and Kaplan was back to square one on suspects. But while he was writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang with a call from one of Dawn's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her security camera for the night of Dawn's murder, and she found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence and drove right to this neighbor's house, where she led him inside, to her computer, where she pressed play. Kaplan leaned in close to the screen and watched the black and white footage of the side of Dawn's townhouse shot from the top of the driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., a few minutes after Kaplan knew that Dawn and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure tipped over Dawn's trash can and then walked up the driveway toward Dawn's garage and disappeared from the screen. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Dawn driving into the garage and then walking out again to go pick up the trash can and then walking back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Dawn's garage. Kaplan could see that light dimming, which meant the garage door was closing, but then inexplicably, the door must have begun going back up again because the light began to get bigger. And at the same time, there were several brief flashes of light, and then after the flashes, the light began to dim again, which meant the garage door closed, eventually leaving the driveway in darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video, and then left the neighbor's house and walked over to Dawn's, trying to piece together what actually happened on the video. He stood inside of Dawn's garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand, and he pressed the button to close the door. And as it closed, Kaplan walked closer until he was almost directly underneath the door's path. And then, when that happened, all of a sudden, the door stopped because Kaplan had actually tripped the sensor by going right underneath it. And as soon as he tripped the sensor, a light on the top of the garage flashed 3 times as the door not only stopped, but began going back the other way. It was clearly how the system worked if it was tripped. And so once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he saw in the video, and then also that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage, and all at once it was like the pieces clicked into place. The suspect must have followed Dawn into the garage. But when they went into the garage, perhaps they tripped the sensor, and so as that door was coming down, the suspect's trying to sneak in, they trip the sensor, the door stops, there's those flashes of light, the door begins to go up again, but the suspect, not wanting Dawn to realize what's going on, rushed over, hits the button, the door shuts, Dawn is none the wiser. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage appeared to be, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on this security video. But, the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Dawn must have known his routine. They also must have known when he would leave to take Sienna to her mother's house, and when he would likely come back home. And they also must have known that Dawn was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, that he wouldn't just let it sit there. He would deal with it that night. He would go down there and he would turn it upright. And when Dawn was doing that, that would give the killer an opportunity to sneak into the garage. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Dawn. They had to have known him very well. Detective Kaplan spent weeks speaking to everyone who knew Don, from coworkers to friends to his entire family, including his first wife and the 2 kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad. However, they said that wasn't true of some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan the person he should be investigating was Don's own brother, Dennis. They said that Don and Dennis had had a falling out about a year earlier, but somehow, after Don's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Don's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over everything ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the family that he was just trying to help, but Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January 2017, so nearly a month after Don was murdered, Kaplan brought Don's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. And seated across the interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up, but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or irritated about it because he was innocent. Dennis said that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015. A little over a year earlier. The family had reached an agreement over what to do with their dad's possessions, but Don had violated that agreement by actually keeping one of their father's cars instead of selling it. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said that he and Don were no longer on speaking terms. Dennis said he had reached out that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Don never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that they could at some point patch things up, if they just tried a little bit harder. But then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Don was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished the explanation. He didn't really buy the reconciliation story, and Dennis's only alibi was that he was home alone when his brother was killed. So Kaplan decided to push. He asked Dennis why he'd started rooting through Don's house the minute the crime scene was cleared. And at this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to do that themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Don's affairs had actually led him to a lead about the murder that he wanted Kaplan to look into. And that was that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Don's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, standing inside with no good explanation for what he was doing there. Dennis said he had heard from Don's neighbors that Don and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole that the landlord was supposed to repair but hadn't yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into a crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair, remembering Benny Ruiz coming to the house on the day Don's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Don. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz into the station for an interview. Like Don's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Don was killed. But he could explain why Dennis had found him inside of Don's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed the dog because nobody was looking after it during the first few days following Don's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there were one person he should be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived, he'd been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse a few blocks away from Don's, and Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it so he could move some of Don's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this strange, and when he ran a background check on Dennis, he discovered he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no. Now, Kaplan already knew about the criminal record because he had run Dennis's name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in his brother's life. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer, but there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Don, as a loving father and a man of faith who had reformed himself after some mistakes in his youth, appeared to be completely accurate. Don's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with Don, over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off, and both she and her new husband Terry had alibis. Don also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. And so there just didn't seem to be anybody who truly wanted Don dead. In February, so about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article saying the police had no suspects and no evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit that it was more or less the truth. The breakthrough that Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, so 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the forensics lab, and they told him a key piece of evidence had just come in. And the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on forensic evidence, interviews, and the police investigation, here's what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of December 28, 2016. The killer waited in the darkness right outside of Don's house until the garage door opened at about 7:40 p.m. At that point, Don drove off with his daughter in the truck, and so the killer immediately darted forward and tipped over a garbage can, and then retreated back to the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Don for a long time. It annoyed them that everyone thought Don was so great, because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been this drug-abusing loser with 2 kids he didn't even care for, and another one who he deserved to lose in Siena. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. So the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it, but finally, they had had enough. Don was just a dark cloud hovering over their life constantly, and he had to go. The killer knew Don well enough to figure out his schedule. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's that evening, and that he'd be coming home alone after that, and that before he went to bed, he would go into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand, which is a small wooden bat used to check tire pressure, and as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 p.m., Don came back, and while he was out fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind a vehicle as Don walked back up the driveway and pressed a button to close the garage door, and then opened the door to his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into position, and as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those lights flashing. And so thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to close the garage door. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement inside the townhouse that would suggest Don was like, "What's going on?" and coming out to check. But Don didn't seem to notice. And so the killer breathed out a sigh of relief and took their position near the door. And then after a while, the doorknob jiggled, and the killer realized this was it. They raised their weapon, and as soon as Don opened the door, they struck him so hard the tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Don again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage they'd been pushing down for so long. Don did everything he could to fight back. I mean, he had turned his life around. He had a daughter that he loved, that he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here. And so as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer. But he had been gravely injured, and when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck and hide. But the killer pulled him out and landed one last punch to his face. Don stopped moving, and at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and they squeezed. But the killer wasn't done. To make sure Don was dead, they also went into Don's apartment, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, came back into the garage, knelt down, and ruthlessly slit Don's throat. Blood ran out of the wound and poured onto the concrete. The killer found some bleach inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could, but they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Don was not able to save his own life, but by aggressively fighting back, he'd given investigators a clue that would solve his murder. and also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Sienna would grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind that solved the case was DNA found under Dawn's fingernails that belonged to none other than Sienna's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's until 9 p.m. was a lie. And so, on April 3rd, 2017, just over 3 months after Dawn's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with murder. After his arrest, Terry cast blame on his wife, Christine, saying she was the one who put him up to it so they could have Sienna to themselves. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder, but the charges against her were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Terry, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 12 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you 2 stories that highlight how the world around us and even our own eyes can play tricks on us. Sometimes what people see is not what's really going on at all. But once people have convinced themselves of something, it can be very hard for them to change their minds. And as you'll see today, sometimes that can lead people into deadly situations. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to, for free, beautifully detail the like button's car. But instead of doing that, once you have their car, just bring it to a huge cliff, put the car in neutral, and push it off. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 1:30 p.m. on the afternoon of May 18, 2007, a 57-year-old woman named Yvonne de Hoorde arrived at a park in Rotterdam, which is a city in the Netherlands. She was there to meet up with her friend, and she had to cut through the park to get to his house. Yvonne went to her friend's house almost every day, and usually when she walked through the park during the week, there weren't that many people around. But on this day, it was really crowded because it was the Friday of a long weekend, and there was just a lot of families and visitors that were enjoying the spring weather, which meant the playground, the pathways, and the park's little cafe were all packed. But Yvonne didn't pay that much attention to the crowds because she was busy thinking about her friend. They'd known each other for years, and they had what she considered to be a very special connection that Yvonne didn't think she had with anybody else. Now, Yvonne knew that a lot of people might say her and her friend's relationship was sort of more strange than special. In fact, some people in her life actually openly disapproved of it. But for Yvonne, it seemed like the main reason for that was, Yvonne was generally pretty friendly and social and sort of an outgoing, normal person. But her friend was extremely reclusive and never left his house. And so it just seemed like an odd pairing. Her friend was originally from Germany, but even though he'd lived in the Netherlands now for years, he'd never learned the language. So he really couldn't communicate with anybody, including Yvonne, at least not in her native tongue. But for Yvonne, if anything, the fact that people didn't necessarily think this was a good idea for them to be friends just made her feel more protective of her friend. And also, she was especially sympathetic to the fact that her friend had actually been abandoned by his mother as a child. And so in a way, she sort of felt like she was stepping in as sort of a maternal figure in her friend's life. And so Yvonne, she rounded a corner on the park's path, and up ahead, there was her friend's house. And she could actually see her friend through one of the windows. And he did not look particularly happy. He looked sort of dejected. And so as she approached, she made a big scene to be very smiley and happy, and she's waving to her friend. And sure enough, her friend at some point turned and looked out the window and saw Yvonne approaching, and he broke into a big smile and he waved back. It's like even though they didn't speak the same language, there clearly was a connection there. And Yvonne was just filled with happiness, so glad that she was here to see him. And so Yvonne, she made her way over to her friend, and that day really was spent the same way they spent all their other days together, which again, they don't speak the same language. So it was just sort of a lot of, body language and gestures and sort of just sitting together and just sort of enjoying each other's company. There wasn't really any direct communication happening, but this was a unique relationship. And for Yvonne, whatever it was enough for her. And she felt like for her friend, it was reciprocated. He appreciated their time together, and that was enough. But even though Yvonne in particular really looked forward to these visits and was having a really nice time on this particular day, she couldn't stay forever. She had a family and other things she needed to get done. So at around 2:30 p.m., after having spent about an hour with her friend, she said goodbye to him, and then she turned and left, knowing that the two of them would see each other again soon. And so Yvonne, after turning and leaving her friend's house, she only got a few steps down the path she came in on when two things happened at once. The first thing was she noticed there was a group of kids in the park who were throwing rocks. And she knew instinctively, like, the kids should not be throwing rocks. So that sort of registered. She wasn't doing anything about it, but she was just aware that there are children throwing rocks nearby. And then the second thing she noticed is she heard splashing coming from behind her. She didn't think it was coming from the kids throwing rocks. She's thinking it didn't rain anytime recently, so there's no reason that there'd be splashing sounds around her. There's no puddles or anything. The only splashing that made sense was it was coming from the stream that was sort of off limits in the park. Nobody had access to it. There was no reason to get down there to that stream, but it sounded very much like that was the splashing that she was hearing. And so Yvonne, she's just consciously aware of these things happening. This was not something that was alarming. She's just aware. And so she found herself turning around to see in particular what that splashing sound was. And as she turned around, something huge smashed into her, pinned her to the ground. All she could hear was screaming throughout the park. And the last thought she had before she blacked out was, "Oh my God, I'm about to die." Not far away, a man named Arvid Hendricks, who had also come to this same park with his wife and his two kids, heard the screams echoing through the park. He was right outside the cafe that Yvonne had been walking towards, and he had just been about to go inside when all this commotion had started. So this particular cafe sat on a path that cut through the park itself. It was a small place, almost like a glorified snack bar, and it had a big pavilion right in front of it with outdoor seating that looked out over the park. And from Arvid's perspective, as he was standing on that pavilion near the cafe entrance, he could hear these people screaming and actually started to see them running in his direction. But Arvid had no idea what they were screaming about or what they were running from. It just seemed like all of a sudden everybody's panicking and coming this way. And so instinctively, Arvid's thinking, okay, there's something threatening going on, and he needs to make sure his family is safe before he even knows what the threat is. So he grabbed his kids and his wife, and he ran into the restaurant along with everybody else. And remember, this restaurant, this cafe, was not huge. Inside, it sort of felt like a dining hall with large communal tables. And so with all these people rushing inside, this place quickly became chaotic. And then after all these people came inside, a few of the people went forward and did their best to barricade the front doors. Even though they were glass and would be pretty easy to break through, they did what they could to sort of block them off. After this, despite there still being this really intense energy sort of buzzing around the room, things actually kind of calmed down. Arvid and probably many other people in this cafe did not know what was going on. They had just sort of reacted instinctively and went in here, assuming there has to be some real threat out there. Let's take shelter. And so there's this weird lull period where everyone's kind of looking around, Arvid included, trying to figure out, is there really a big threat out there or are we overreacting here? And as they're all sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, the front doors, the glass doors, suddenly shatter. And once again, the whole group is thrust into absolute chaos once again, as all the parents are grabbing their kids, and even though they still don't really know what's going on, they're trying to rush towards those shattered doors to get out of this place, which now feels like it is dangerous, in some ways worse than outside. And so it's this huge bottleneck as the door, as everyone's screaming, there's just madness happening. And Arvid, he could tell there was no way he could get through this cluster of people desperately trying to get out. And so he just grabbed his wife and his kids, and they went under one of the tables and they hid. And for the next couple of minutes, everything all around Arvid and his family continued to be absolutely chaotic and madness. But then eventually, everything just went quiet as everybody else made their way out of the cafe. And it was just Arvid and his family sitting there wondering what the heck is going on. And for a moment, Arvid felt like, okay, I'm safe. I don't know what's going on, but me and my family, we are safe. However, before he instructed his kids and his wife to come out of their hiding spot, he heard the sound of more glass shattering, and then he heard these loud stomping sounds as something huge was making its way through those front doors into the cafe. And suddenly, it hit Arvid when he looked out and saw what it was, why everybody was running. And he also realized that he and his family were now trapped. It would turn out all the people in Yvonne's life who frowned on her special friendship had been right to do so. Because although Yvonne loved her daily routine with her friend did not actually feel the same way. Every day when Yvonne went to visit, she would sit with her friend and keep him company. And Yvonne's friend would smile back at her. This was sort of the rapport they had developed, at least in Yvonne's mind. The smiling back and forth suggested they were friends. What Yvonne didn't realize is that them smiling back and forth was actually something her friend hated. And on that particular Friday afternoon, her friend was already in a very bad mood. The park that surrounded his house was so crowded and so loud, and those kids who Yvonne saw throwing rocks when she left had been doing it earlier. They were throwing rocks that whole time that she was visiting with her friend, and some of those rocks were hitting her friend's house. And it was making him so agitated and mad. And then the whole time through this interaction, Yvonne is smiling over and over at her friend, thinking this is so great. And it just totally sent her friend over the edge. And so when Yvonne finally left and walked away, the friend, should have felt relieved because now, one of the things that was really agitating him was gone. Yvonne, she was gone. But the friend knew she wasn't really leaving for good. She would just come back tomorrow, like she always did, with that same enraging smile on top of all the other things that were so annoying. And the friend just could not take it any longer. So he snapped. He stormed out of his house, splashing through that off-limits stream in the park to get to Yvonne as she walked away. And just before he reached her, she turned around and saw him. This time, he smiled at Yvonne before she could smile at him. And for once, she didn't smile back. Instead, she looked terrified. And this was because Yvonne's friend was a 400-pound silverback gorilla named Boquito. And the park he lived in was a zoo. To silverback gorillas, smiling is not a sign of friendship. It's a sign of aggression and hostility. So it's very likely that from Boquito's point of view, almost every day for years, Yvonne had been coming to his enclosure, in essence, to threaten him. At least that's very likely how he interpreted it. And he had been basically threatening her back whenever he smiled by showing his teeth. And he thought maybe that would get her to go away, but it never worked. She always came back and just continued to threaten him. And so eventually, like the story goes, it became too much. Luckily though, Boquito didn't harm really anybody except for Yvonne. He bit her over 100 times and broke multiple bones, but Yvonne did survive. But no other guests were harmed, including Arvid and his family. They were trapped in that cafe with Boquito, who after attacking Yvonne had charged in there and was walking around, but Boquito never attacked. And so at a certain point, Arvid and his family were able to run to safety. After she recovered, Yvonne would tell the media that Boquito was still her darling. That's what she called him. And in fact, she would go back to the zoo to see Boquito after that. But this time, she didn't smile. At 3 a.m. on August 11th, 1965, A 19-year-old student named Ali Dogan sat in the front seat of a passenger bus as it headed down a dark, narrow road in northwest Turkey. Ali and about 50 other passengers were on their way from the city of Ankara to Istanbul, which is the largest city in Turkey, and they were about 3 hours into a 5-hour trip. Ali had passed the time so far by speaking with the man who just happened to be sitting next to him. He was an Air Force lieutenant. The lieutenant told Ali that originally he had actually been booked to take a flight to Istanbul, but he had missed the flight, and so here he was on the bus. But he told Ali that actually he was really enjoying this bus ride. He had never been on a long bus ride before, and critically, he had scored the very front seat in the bus, so he could basically see out the front window of the bus. And so for him, that was kind of exhilarating. And for Ali, he had actually switched spots with a previous passenger who had been sitting next to the lieutenant when they first boarded. He had switched with that person because Ali, the reason he was switching, was he wanted that view too. And so he and this lieutenant were sort of bonding over their shared excitement over, watching the road as they drove for hours on end. Ali and the lieutenant spoke in very quiet voices since almost everybody else on the bus was fast asleep. But these two, they're pumped, they're watching the road, they're talking about it quietly. But at a certain point, Ali, despite his enthusiasm for this ride, he started to feel pretty drowsy too. Ali was on his way back to Istanbul where he went to college. And later that day, because right now it's 3 a.m., later that day, he had a big exam. And he knew that as much as he wanted to stay up and sort of enjoy the ride, he really needed to get some sleep. So he took his sweatshirt and rolled it up like a pillow, put it behind his head, told the lieutenant he was going to sleep for a bit, and then he put his head back and closed his eyes. However, about 15 minutes later, when Ali was just really beginning to actually fall asleep, the bus was suddenly filled with screams, and Ali, he opened his eyes and he was looking out forward in the direction the bus was going, and he saw these bright headlights bearing down on the bus, and he knew they were about to collide with somebody on the road, and then the bus hard swerved to the right, and Ali's trying to hold on to the partition to keep himself seated, and he's getting ready to smash into this other vehicle, but right at the last second, the bus turns and slams off the road and comes crashing down in this ditch right off the side of the road. And then the bus kind of lurched to a stop because the bus driver was able to stop the crash. And for a second, Ali's looking around. Everyone's so shaken up by this. And he's feeling, very relieved that they did not smash into an oncoming car. But despite feeling that relief, Ali quickly realized they had another problem. The bus was starting to fill with smoke. And so Ali and the lieutenant, in virtue of sitting at the very front of the bus, were the closest to the door leading off the bus. And now clearly everybody needs to evacuate. There's some kind of fire that's happening because of the crash they've just been in. And so Ali and the lieutenant, they stand up, and the bus is kind of at a slant here because they're in this ditch, and they go up to the very front of the bus, and they actually look out the cracked front windshield, and they see there's this huge truck also in the ditch on the side of the road. And they're figuring that they must have collided in some way, like that was the truck that forced the bus off the road. And so it's like, okay, they've gotten into this accident. There's clearly a fire. We just got to get off this bus. And so Ali and the lieutenant, they get to the door and they try to open it. But the way the bus kind of crashed into this ditch, it sort of warped the frame of the bus. And so the lieutenant, he got down there and he began smashing on this door to try to open it up. And as this is happening, the smoke is getting much more intense inside of this bus, and all the people on the bus, the 50 some odd passengers behind them, they're starting to panic. Everyone's rushing forward, bumping into Ali and the lieutenant, trying to get off this bus. And then finally, the lieutenant, he manages to force open the doors. And the second he does, this additional rush of black smoke comes pouring into the bus. It's like you can't even see anything. Everyone's choking and screaming. And the lieutenant, he just yells to Ali to go, get out, jump out. And so Ali, he's the first one off the bus. He climbs down the steps. All he sees is smoke everywhere. He really has no idea where the fire is actually coming from. And so instinctively, he just jumps out of the bus, just jumps as high and as far as he possibly can. And he actually hits the other side of the ditch. And he kind of stumbles and climbs up and gets away from the bus. And as soon as he did, he turned around and he's looking at the bus, and it's nighttime, but even still in the darkness, he just sees the bus is completely engulfed in all this smoke. He can't quite tell where the fire is. He's thinking, the engine must have caught fire and it's spreading across the undercarriage of the bus, but it's getting so bad. And he's hearing all the people on board desperately trying to get off out that door the lieutenant had forced open. but there's some kind of bottleneck. They're not getting out. It's like they're stampeding towards the front of the bus. People are screaming, it's chaos. And then Allie hears some of the windows being pushed open. People start jumping out the windows. I mean, they are desperate to get off this bus. And at first, what Allie hears are screams of what sounds like desperate and scared people just trying to evacuate. But quickly, those screams, when the folks started coming out of the bus, turned to pure agony. But as Allie is listening to this and watching this disaster unfold, he's thinking, okay, well, the reason they're screaming is because it's possible they could be catching on fire here, or maybe, they're jumping off and breaking bones or getting hurt from leaping out the window, and that's all terrible. But people are getting out of this bus, and before long, they're going to come up and over that side of the ditch, and they're going to join me. Like, these people, they're coming out of the bus. I'm seeing it happen. But all that happened is the screams of agony got louder and louder, and nobody came over that ditch. It was Allie all alone, and he had no idea why. All he sees is smoke, and all he hears is screams. And then at some point, authorities show up, and they clearly are right into the fray, trying to extinguish whatever fire is going on and trying to get people out and away from the bus. But despite this huge effort that Allie's watching happen right in front of him, granted it's obscured by the smoke, still nobody, including the lieutenant, came over the ditch to come be with Allie. He was all alone. But eventually, Allie noticed a few of the authorities that had shown up to assist in this emergency were walking away from the smoke in the bus, carrying what appeared to be bodies. But as Allie stared at these people carrying these bodies, he realized they weren't whole bodies. They were body parts. It would turn out most of Allie's and the rest of the passengers' assumptions about exactly what happened in that crash were correct. The bus they were riding in did swerve after seeing the headlights of an oncoming vehicle. And it did hit that big truck they saw on the side of the road when Allie and the lieutenant first got to the front of the bus and looked out. That was the truck they hit. Now, it was not a head-on collision. It was sort of a glancing blow as the bus swerved to avoid a head-on collision. But that crash sent the bus off the road into the ditch, and it was that crash into the ditch that ultimately prompted all that smoke. But they were all wrong about what was causing that smoke. There was no fire. The truck that the bus narrowly avoided the head-on collision with, but did ultimately strike, causing both the bus to crash and the truck to crash, that truck was a shipping truck, and it was transporting a huge amount of freight to Istanbul. And the collision burst the truck's shipping containers, and so the contents of those containers, the freight itself, poured out into that ditch. And that ditch that basically the bus had landed inside of, that Allie had sort of jumped over on his way to get out of the bus, and that others were sort of falling into when they were coming out of the bus to avoid this, fire, or so they thought. It already had some water in it when that freight entered into the ditch. So the freight and the water combined. And that combination caused a chemical reaction, and that chemical reaction caused the smoke. Because that freight was nitric acid, a highly corrosive, highly toxic liquid chemical that now, despite being diluted by the water in the ditch, had basically filled the ditch. The ditch is now effectively an acid bath that's smoking, giving the impression the bus is on fire. And so all these folks are leaping out of the bus and landing in the ditch, which again is an acid bath, and they're being dissolved by the acid. Allie, when he left the bus first, he leapt out of the bus. He thought there was the fire right there, and he jumped up and out trying to clear the fire. And what he really did is he cleared the acid bath and landed on the other side, avoiding dissolving in the acid. But virtually everybody else in the bus was going right into the acid. And so in the end, of the nearly 50 people on board that bus, 26 literally dissolved to death. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.